A hello and greetings to everyone out there in Facebook land that are joining with us also. And like I was just saying, we're not going to talk about Gideon today. We're going to move on a little bit. I felt like I wanted to address kind of some of the fears and things going on and around today. So rather than Gideon, we're going to talk a little bit about fear. Hopefully, have a real honest conversation and look at fear and what our response as children of God are supposed to be. So we're going to take a look at another story. It's a familiar one of Jesus walking in the water, but I've got a few things I want to pull out of that. It just seems that there's been a lot of fear in the news the last couple of weeks, especially the last couple of days. As a family, we don't sit down and watch the news every night, but Friday we did. We watched the whole TV news cycle. We watched the national news, and it was all about this COVID-19, the coronavirus, and then we watched the local news, and it was all pretty much about coronavirus. There's a couple local interest stories that might really not be about it. They tried to talk about St. Patrick's Day, but really it was a story about local businesses, restaurants and bars, and what impact this was going to have on them. So that really was all about it. Then it rolled into the entertainment news, and they rolled out Dustin Hoffman to talk about the coronavirus because he was in some movie about a virus 20 years ago. So it's just like we were just inundated with this. I mean, this is the thing that's all over Facebook. It's all over social media. It's on the late night talk shows. So it just seems amiss for us not to talk about this a little bit. We're living in a world. This is fairly recent when I started thinking about this and writing this. It's old news now, but March Madness has been canceled. The NBA and the NFL have followed suit. Concerts, weddings, church services are being canceled all over the country. Here in Montana, as of this morning, there were 4 confirmed cases of COVID-19, and I read that there's an additional 2 that probably by now have been confirmed this morning as close as Missoula. A state of emergency has been declared in Montana. High school sports seasons are being cut short, and there's even discussion of the possibility of closing public schools here in Polson. All of this in an attempt to rein in the spread of this new, scary, flu-like viral infection. Panic and fear seem to be the normal for today. So I'd like to have a little honest talk about fear this morning. Fear is spreading faster than the virus itself. Many people are honestly concerned about infection. Possibly even some of us here this morning, and certainly some of us who call Polson Alliance their home. Certainly as a congregation, we are at higher risk bracket for any illness, pandemic or not. We're a little on the seasoned side of life, on age and experience. And any illness, a pandemic or not, we're in a higher risk group of having medical concerns for risk factors of any viral disease, not just COVID-19. On the one hand, I would like to encourage us not to become jaded and cold towards our neighbors here in Polson, around the state, around the country, and around the world. I know, especially living here in Polson, the fear and panic seems so out of place, so far off. It was always, someplace. It's someplace else. Now it's getting a little closer. It's Missoula. So I'd like to kind of warn us off of some of the irrational jokes, some of the making light of it. I'd like to remind us to be people of grace and mercy, because we're a people who have received grace and mercy from Jesus. I'm one of the first ones to turn to humor, and I lean in towards dark humor also. But I think in this day and age, I think I'm speaking to myself as much as anyone else, to be mindful that I think people really are concerned and they really are afraid, and this really is starting to affect affect loved ones. So I love a good Corona and lime joke as much as everyone else. But I just really like to remind us and encourage us to lean in to grace and mercy in this season. I suppose as I think about my own reactions to the shutdowns and the shortages, and I'm reminded of my feelings of other times when things get shut down. And I suppose probably the most common time that we experience these kind of shutdowns is the old snow day, right? So a principal or a school board or a mayor or somebody looks at the weather early some winter morning, and they see the forecast, and there's 2 feet of snow coming potentially, or record-breaking cold temperatures, and they have to look at that situation and say, is it safe for us to go to school? Is it safe for our kids and our teachers? And they make a call, right? And they say, okay, we're going to cancel school today because that's just what's best for everyone. And then the snow comes, right? And we're all kind of sit back and kind of go, okay, that probably was a good thing. It's probably best that we didn't go to school, and the canceling school made me take a day off work, and we're all just going to stay home, and we're all going to be safe. But sometimes, the snow day is called, and you look out your window, and you see blue skies, and it's really not that cold, and the snow just doesn't come. So we all get frustrated with that principal or that school board or whoever makes that call to call the school day. Sometimes, at least the last couple days, the last couple weeks, it might feel like that. And if that's the case, and if we really don't need to shut everything down, I just want to remind us to be people of grace and mercy, and people our state and local and federal and church leaderships, they're all taking the information and trying to keep us all safe. So let's be people of wisdom. I know sometimes it feels like I'm standing in my driveway and I'm thinking, hey, I can drive through the snow. It's not that cold. It's not even snowing on my block. So as we face this confusion and this fear and the possible frustration of these coronavirus shutdowns being unnecessary, let us not be driven by fear or paranoia. Rather, let us have some grace and some wisdom in all of this. Let us be people of grace and mercy. Let us be wise. Let's be safe. Let's trust Jesus in all of this. So on the other hand, though, I don't want to shame or condemn anyone for being afraid. Rather, I would like to encourage us to let it lead us towards our Lord. Let it lead us towards Jesus and a deeper trust. Let it lead us to leaning into faith rather than deeper into anxiety and worry. We serve a mighty and a loving King. He's got this. In the uncertainty of today, let's turn to King Jesus for our hope. We have that right. We have that privilege. We've got a God who can handle this. So I suppose the question I want to ask us this morning is this: what are you afraid of? The loss of a loved one? Could be. It could happen. But it's going to happen eventually anyway, whether it's today or another day. The loss of income could be a real concern. I've spoken the last couple of days with local business owners and restaurants, and it really is affecting their ability to make a living. Let's pray about it. Fear of becoming infected and losing your own life or becoming ill. Let God free us from the tyranny of the fear of death today. That's a message for today. It's a message for every day. Jesus has conquered death and illness. Let's trust in Him. Let's have faith and hope. Are you afraid of outsiders? This is started off as a Chinese thing, as a foreign thing that's come in and invaded our country. So are you afraid of outsiders? Are we afraid of another culture or another community or another people group? If that's the case, may we look clearly in the eye those feelings, that sentiment. Let's face that head on and may God change the attitudes of our hearts to be more like His in this. This is not a time to give in to fear. It's a time to lean into hope and faith. Now, fear does have some value. It does have its place. Some fear is good, right? It protects us. It keeps us away from real danger like fire and falling off of cliffs and spiders, right? It's right to have fear about some things in life. Last week, though, the Alliance President John Stumbo released a short video discussing our response to the coronavirus as an Alliance family. And I really appreciate some of the things that he had to say specifically about fear. He said this, and I'm quoting him imperfectly, I'm sure. This is probably more of a paraphrase, but he said, "It's right to have fear about some things in this life. But that value is always disrupted when the place is given too much priority." When fear is given too much priority, it disrupts the rest of life. Again, some fear is helpful, but when fear leads, it almost always leads us to a negative place. Fear never leads us to hope. It'll never lead us to grace. It'll never lead us to be the people of God. As believers, we should never let fear lead us. Fear should never be the loudest voice we listen to. Rather, let the voice of God be heard. Let wisdom, let good judgment, let faith, hope, love, and trust in the sovereignty of God speak loudest. Let it speak to us. Let it speak through us. Is God afraid in this moment? No, He's not. So we need to get into His heart and not let fear have this day. I agree with John Stumbo that this is the moment for the church to be the church. Fear causes us to run away, but hope causes us to step into a moment. As the church, that is what we have today. That's what we have to offer. Hope. The hope of the gospel is brighter today than ever. Let us use the fear of today as an opportunity to give hope to the world around us. I agree with President Stumbo. Let's be the church in this. Let's be the gospel to a world desperately needing hope, especially in this day. This is an opportunity to speak hope and grace and love to our neighbors, to our friends, to our families, to our co-workers. Let's use this opportunity for the gospel. I probably could just stop right here and be done. But we all know I'm not going to do that. So I'd like to take this opportunity to just talk a little bit more about fear and how we should respond to it as children of God. I want to talk about fear and what it can do for us as we face it as a disciple. We're all afraid of something. Every single one of us. All of us are born with an instinctive built-in set of fears, and we probably pick up a few along the way from our experiences as well. Fear of things like the fear of falling, the fear of the dark, the fear of spiders. We're all afraid of something. We're all afraid of loss or rejection, of a future that we don't know what's going to happen. We all have fears. The number one fear among all people is a fear of public speaking, and yet some of us choose to spend our lives and our professions doing just that. We're all afraid of what people might say or think about us. You have fears. I have fears. But you know what? God is not surprised by your fears. God is not taken aback by your fears. Fear not just might be the most common instruction that God gives us in Scriptures. Depending on what translation you use and how broadly you want to take that command to fear not or do not fear or that sentiment, that command to be not afraid or fear not occurs somewhere between 110 and 366 times in the English Bible. The Bible, God, I think, is trying to tell his people something. God does not want his people to live in fear. God does not want you to live in fear. I love the challenge that God gives to Joshua. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. You can find that in Joshua 1:9. It's easy to read the words, do not be afraid or dismayed, but it can be really, really hard to live them out. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. The fears that keep you from living life to its fullest. The fears that keep us from being really, really alive in Christ. The fears that keep us from being the individuals, from being the persons, and corporately being the church that God has created you to be. That God has brought us together to be. I've already said that fears are good. They keep us away from things that can harm us. But sometimes fears are sinful. Sometimes our fears are irrational. Sometimes our fears can be debilitating. When fear takes too much of the lead in our lives, when it takes too much of the priority, they become sinful or they become phobias. So I found a website that lists more than 600 phobias. I've heard of many of them. Some of them like arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, or claustrophobia, the fear of closed-in spaces, or agoraphobia, the fear of wide open spaces. Let's make up our mind, people. But there are a lot that I'd never heard of. Some I hope that no one here this morning has. So I got to ask, does anyone here have homileophobia? Whew, good, I hope not. That's the fear of sermons. How about lutrophobia? That's the fear of otters. Who knew? There are people who are afraid of otters. I've always thought otters they're so cute. They're so playful. I mean, I want one as a pet. Who doesn't love otters? But apparently there are people who are terrified of otters. If you're afraid of otters, I'm sorry for bringing it up. I didn't mean to trigger anything. There's just all sorts of things that we're afraid of that become irrational, that keep us from being who we are, that keep us from living, that keep us from being the children of God, brave, courageous, and strong. Fear not. So you know what I'm afraid of? I'm just keeping things a little light right now before I get a little more serious. I couldn't find the name for this one, but I'm afraid of caged birds. Caged birds. Bird in the field, I'm just fine. I've actually had a bald eagle fly into my car, spread eagle in front of my window, and peck my windows. Totally cool. That was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. But you take a little yellow and green parakeet and you put it in a cage and put it in your living room? No. It's hard for me to go buy food at the feed store in Ronan because there's this caged birds right there by the door. I just got to do it. Fear can be irrational. Now, the website didn't offer any help for any of these phobias, especially not for whatever caged bird phobia is. It was only interested in the names. But my interest, our interest this morning is to help us grow spiritually through our fears and because of our fears. So I'd like to share a few observations about fear that we can find in Matthew's gospel. You can go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 14. We're starting in verse 22. You can find that on page 820 on your table Bibles if you're using those. So this is a passage that's really about fear. Our passage begins with Jesus putting his disciples onto a boat and sending them ahead of himself. They had just fed 5,000 people with a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread, and now Jesus wanted to withdraw to be by himself for a bit. So he put the disciples on a boat and sends them on ahead so he can have some time for prayer. We're picking up again in verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way off from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it's I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got up out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, truly you are the Son of God." So how do we grow spiritually? Through our fears. How do we grow closer to God of the universe? Through our fears. We see the first observation in verse 26. You have to admit your fears. This is basic. This is where it starts. You have to admit your fears, and admitting your fears is tough. Any of us guys in here, any of the male types, do you want to give an amen to me on this? A lot of us manly men types don't like to admit fear. Guys, do any of you like to admit fear? I don't. Our natural response is to say, "I'm not afraid." But our natural response is a lie. It's a lie. Me afraid? Oh, no, I'm not afraid. My buddy Danny over there, he might be a little afraid right now, but not me. I got this. We want to conquer our fears. But when we admit them, that's when we can begin to change. You see, the disciples did this. We read in verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Here's 12 manly men. They're fishermen. They're outdoor types. You know, they belong here in Montana, right? They're terrified. They cry out in fear. Before we go any further this morning, I want to ask you this. What is it that you're afraid of? We had a little fun with phobias just a moment ago, but now I want to get real here. Being afraid of birds in cages is one thing, but it doesn't really stop me from doing anything. That's not a real driving fear. like the fear of not being accepted, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of just being that stupid kid. Those are fears. Those are fears that keep you from getting things done. The fear of not being good enough, whatever good enough might be. So what are the fears keeping you from really living free? What's holding you back from living the life the way God intended for you to live? Free, grace-filled, loving, powerful. What are your fears over what God is doing in your life? Our church, your family. What's keeping you back from going deeper with God into a more intimate relationship with Him? Is it a fear of joining and belonging to something? A loss of control and autonomy? Is it a fear of sharing with a friend or a family member what God has done? What God is doing in your life today? Is it rejection? Is it a fear of what they may do this year? Whoever they might be at the moment. Is it a fear of what they might take from you? I have always said I don't want to talk politics from the pulpit, and I won't. But I will talk about our culture. And I will talk about the world we live in. I will talk about being God's people. We are living in a time that our national and our cultural discussions are driven by fear. They're driven by a certain kind of fear. And I really believe this, especially in the last couple weeks. But I think in the last couple years, we're driven by a certain kind of fear that's particularly insidious. It's the fear of loss. It's the fear of what someone is going to take away from us. It's not like in previous generations. I'm thinking specifically of the World War II generation that fought against fascism and Nazism. They fought against a real, tangible threat. There was a specific evil that they could look at and say, that's what we're fighting against. That's what the fight is for. It was specific and tangible. But that's different than this vague fear that we seem to be living in today. So we're afraid of a lot of different things. And I think we don't always know what we're afraid of. So we end up being afraid of immigrants or people that are different than us. People who are richer than us, or people that are poorer than us, or people that are browner than us, or people that are whiter than us, people that are more religious than us, people that are less religious than us. Maybe we're afraid of racists, or evil corporations, or the drug companies, or maybe even the government itself. You see, today, I don't think it really matters which end of the political spectrum you find yourself in. It's all about fear. And it's all about what they are going to take from you, what they are going to do to you. But this isn't what God intends for His people. He tells us, "Fear not, for I am with you." And that's the hope for us today. So what is it that you're afraid of this morning? I'd like you to go ahead and take a moment and let God reveal what they are to you right now. Go ahead and take a moment. I'm not going to call on you, but I'm going to give you a moment. Whatever they are, whatever it is that you're afraid of, there's freedom when you admit and you confess. And when you give them over to God, there's freedom. Be strong. Be courageous, for I am with you. That's what God's telling us today. So the second thing we need to do is to take the risk. We read in verse 29, come. So Peter got out of his boat and he walked out on the water and came to Jesus. Sometimes you just got to take the risk. You got to face your fears. But just like admitting your fears, it isn't natural to face them either. When your mom sent you off to school in the morning, she didn't tell you, have a risky day. Be dangerous at school. Swing upside down on the monkey bars. Or, hey, remember to only look one way when you cross the street. No, we tell our kids to be careful out there because it's a dangerous world. Risk-taking doesn't come naturally to most of us, but spiritual growth involves risk. And risk goes hand in hand with fear. That was a big step that Peter took out of the boat. It was risky. It was something he had never done before. But what did it lead him towards? It led him closer to Jesus. It led him into intimacy with the Lord. With Peter, it wasn't just any old risk just for the sake of a risk. He didn't step out into that boat for the thrill of it. He stepped out because it was Jesus calling to him. Doing something risky just because it's risky is dumb. But doing something you know God is calling you to do is faith. You've got to take risks. You've got to get out of the boat. And it takes courage. Now, courage isn't just the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing even when you're afraid. Courage is rejecting comfort and doing the very thing that you're afraid of, because that's what you've been called to do. Fear just gets worse when you don't take action. Lack of action just adds fuel to the fear. If you're not taking risks, when you don't take the risk with your fears, what happens? They just get bigger. We just become more afraid. Have you ever had a fear, and when you begin to think about it, you start to create a worst case scenario that could never actually happen in your head, right? We've all done this. I've learned this week that there actually is a technical term for this. It's called catastrophizing. Catastrophizing. You create the catastrophes that never actually happen. They don't happen, and yet they're still real to you. The effect on your life is real, even though the catastrophe never happened. That just seemed really, really familiar today. I don't know what this afternoon brings with the coronavirus. It's easy to give into fear. I woke up at like 2 o'clock this morning and my beard was itchy and I can't quit touching my face and I got a little tickle in my throat and I'm thinking, I'm gonna die. I did it. Here I am. It just seems familiar today. Take the risk. Get out of the boat. Some of us just might need to hear this message today. What is God calling you to do? Don't stay safe in the boat. Life isn't meant to be safe. And let's be honest, that boat wasn't terribly safe anyway. It was in the middle of a storm after all. And those 12 big burly men were terrified. Almost every time I've heard this passage preached, I've heard that Peter was a failure for taking his eyes off Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus is the takeaway. And to be honest, I've preached that as well. But as I read through this passage today, you know what? I'm thinking Peter wasn't a failure here. Peter was a success because he admitted his fear. He faced his fears. He listened to the call of Jesus and he stepped out of the boat into the storm towards Jesus. And he was sitting in that boat with 11 men who didn't do it. Peter wasn't a failure. Peter was a success. And that brings us to our next observation. You've got to expect fear to return. I would love to leave this one completely out of the message. I'd love to just be a cheerleader and say, go for it. Just take the risk. Just do it. But the reality is that fear is going to return. It did with Peter. Jesus said, come, and he popped over the side of that boat and walked out on the water. Then, bam, there it is. It returns. Look at verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. Fear is going to return. You step out on faith and decide to help to teach Sunday school. So you get the curriculum, you go to the class, and there you are in front of these 4-year-olds, and you start thinking, I'm not good enough. I just don't know the Bible well enough. What if I can't run the DVD player? Fear is going to return. You can count on it. Some of you want to have some courage. You want to invite a friend to coffee. You're finally going to tell them about the change that God has done in your life. You're all excited to share this, to share Jesus with your friend. You're ready to do it. You're ready to share your story. You're ready to invite them into what Jesus is doing in your life and what you desperately believe and know that Jesus wants to do in their life. And then you see him walk through the door and the fear returns and you just want to change the subject and you want to talk about anything else. Fear is going to return. Fear of rejection. Fear of failure. They loom all around. So let's say you step out. Let's say you do fail. Like, not perceived failure. Let's just go ahead and assume that you have actual failure. You take the risk and you fail. You tried working with those 4-year-olds and they cried. And you cried. And parents cried. And there's crying. You failed. What do you do then? What do you do with that? You embrace the presence of God. Let me say that again. When you fail, you embrace the presence of God. When you begin to sink like Peter did, here's the good news. When you sink, God doesn't. When you sink, God doesn't. Let's take a look at verse 31. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Immediately, Jesus reached out. Immediately. Instantly. In that very moment of fear, Jesus reaches out. In the moment of fear, You embrace the presence of God even when you failed. When you fail, God doesn't. What I do know about God's character through His Word and through my own experience is this: God's presence is 24/7. There is not a moment in your day that you cannot be in the presence of God. It's 24/7. God simply does not have a part-time role in the life of a believer. God does not share split custody with His kids. He doesn't just get them for the weekend. God is always there. You're not just God's child on the weekend. God isn't your daddy just on Sunday morning. In the middle of your fear, in the middle of your failure, God is there, and you can be in His presence. Now, if you're anything like me, you might have a part-time memory. I think at times we all have part-time memories when we focus on our fears and our doubts, and we forget about God's real presence in our lives. Let's not be part-time children of a full-time daddy. As I think about my fears, I realize that one of the battles that looms within me is the fear of rejection. And it's very real. It's hard to admit, but it's true. I've got fears that are real, just like you. But here's what I found. When I focus on my fear, when I give it a lot of power by thinking about it, by dwelling on it, when I keep that fear in front of me all of the time, I find I lose sight of the presence of God. And I have a tough time seeing God. Peter had a tough time too. Look back at what he said in verse 28. Peter answered him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water. So maybe today, in the midst of your fear, maybe today in the midst of your storm, maybe today when you're fearful, it might be tough to see God. It's tough to see God when you're afraid. But I don't want to leave here today without us hearing His promise. God's promise is this: I will never leave you. It's not just be strong. It's not just be not afraid. Be strong. Be courageous. That's the command. The promise is, I will be with you. I will never leave you. See, God's promise is this: there's absolutely nothing that you or I can't do. There's nothing that God is going to ask us to do that we can't do together. There's nothing that we can't do through Him. There's nothing we can't handle. And when you and I do come into His presence, and when our fear does diminish, and our faith does increase, that's when we'll see the fifth thing that I want us to learn from our passage this morning. And simply this: give the praise to God. It's easy when we've conquered our fear to pat ourselves on the back, or to give credit to some self-help book or some seminar, something that we've done. Now, those very likely might be good tools. They might be helpful. But let's not forget to give credit where credit is due. And let's give the praise to God. That's what the disciples did. Take a look at verses 32 and 33. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. See, God acted. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." You see, this whole event, this whole thing ends in worship. It starts with fear, and it ends in worship. I think that's beautiful. I think that's fantastic. I think that's something we can hold on to today. When you worship, you don't have time to worry. When you worship, you focus on God. When you worship, you don't focus on your fears. So let's recap here. What do we do with our fears? Fears that are real, that are personal. What do we do with them? We admit them. We identify them. We confess them. We give them over to God. Our fears must move us to more faith, not to less. Our fears must move us to more faith. And having more faith, we draw closer to God. And drawing closer to God, we worship him. And worshiping him, we focus on him. And focusing on him, we take our focus off our fears. It's a beautiful cycle, isn't it? It's a nice little bookend. So that's where I want to end today. I want to end with that. Let's draw closer to God. Today, in today's particular fears of this coronavirus, tomorrow's fears of election cycle, going into sick parents and kids, getting ready to go off to college, hoping to have kids, or can we even have kids? Whatever it is we're facing, whatever the fear is today, it really doesn't matter because the response is always the same. God's bigger than it. And we can turn to him. He's our God of hope. He's our God of healing. He's a sovereign God over all creation. He's a sovereign God over all nations. He's a sovereign God over our church and over us. He's a loving God, and he's a loving Father. He's not going to leave you. He's not going to forsake you. And he certainly does not want you to live in fear. Not in fear of the coronavirus. Not in fear of who's going to be president. Not in fear of our government or our neighbors or sickness or death or anything else we can come up with. In our fear, turn to him. Amen? Can we do that? Let's pray.